The iron hooks were still there when I bought the property in 2019, rusted into the doorframe of what used to be Samuel Pritchard's smithy. 7 of them, each bent at an unnatural angle, pointing downward like accusing fingers. The real estate agent said they were decorative. She was wrong. I found Samuel's journal 3 weeks later, wrapped in oilcloth and shoved behind a loose stone in the forge. The leather cover was scorched on one side, and the pages smelled like sulfur and something else, something organic and rotten. What I read in those pages made me understand why 7 families had owned this property since 1881, and why none of them had lasted more than 2 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what Samuel Pritchard forged in the winter of 1880, and why the old-timers in Granger County still won't walk past this property after dark. Samuel came to the Cumberland Gap region in 1877 with his wife Margaret and their daughter Emily, who was 8 years old. He was a skilled blacksmith from Pennsylvania, and he'd heard the mountains of eastern Tennessee needed men who could work metal. What he didn't know was why the previous blacksmith had disappeared, leaving his tools and half-finished work behind. The locals were friendly enough at first. They brought him horseshoes to make, tools to repair, iron gates to forge. Samuel was good at his work, better than good. He had a talent for it that went beyond simple skill. When he heated metal in his forge, it seemed to bend to his will in ways that defied normal metallurgy. His creations were stronger, lasted longer, and had a beauty that was almost unsettling. "There's something in the way he works," wrote Josiah Trent, who owned the general store. "Like he's not just shaping iron, but having a conversation with it." For the first year, everything was fine. Samuel built a good business, Margaret made friends with the church ladies, Emily attended the one-room schoolhouse and played with the other children. They were happy, or as happy as anyone could be in those hard mountains where life was measured in seasons survived and children raised to adulthood. It was in the autumn of 1878 that things changed. Samuel's journal entries from that period are fragmented, but the story they tell is clear enough. It started with sounds at night. Knocking at the door after midnight, scratching at the windows. Margaret heard it first. October 3rd, 1878. Margaret says there was knocking last night. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more. I heard nothing, being deep in sleep after a long day at the forge. She is certain someone was at our door, but when I checked this morning, there were no footprints in the frost, no marks on the door. I told her it must have been a branch or an animal. She did not look convinced. The knocking continued. 3 nights later, Emily heard it too. This time, Samuel woke up and went to the door with his rifle. Nothing, no one. Just the dark mountains and the sound of wind through the trees. October 7th, 1878. The knocking came again. All 3 of us heard it clearly. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. I threw open the door, ready to shoot whatever vagrant or prankster thought to disturb us. The moon was full and bright. I could see clearly down the path into the clearing around our home. There was no one. But here is what troubles me. The knocking continued even as I stood in the open doorway. 3 knocks, as if someone was striking the door I was standing behind. Yet I could see the door and nothing touched it. This is where most people would have left. Packed up and moved back to Pennsylvania or down into the valley towns. But Samuel had invested everything in his smithy. More than that, he had pride. He wasn't going to be driven off by what he still believed must have some rational explanation. He asked around town carefully, not wanting to seem foolish. That's when he learned about the guests. Old Thomas Macready told him, sitting on the porch of Trent's store, whittling a piece of cedar. Thomas was in his 70s, had been in these mountains his whole life. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. Some places in these mountains, the land remembers things it shouldn't. Some places, the veil between here and elsewhere is thin as a widow's wedding dress. You built your smithy on one of those places, Samuel. The last blacksmith, Henderson, he learned that too late. What happened to Henderson? Samuel asked. Thomas stopped whittling. He let them in. The old man explained that the knocking was an invitation, or rather a request for invitation. The guests, as locals called them, couldn't come into a home unless invited. But they were persistent. They would knock and scratch and call until someone, out of frustration or fear or simple human courtesy, opened the door and said the wrong thing. "What's the wrong thing?" Samuel asked. "Come in. Enter. Welcome." Any word of invitation. Henderson, he got worn down by it. Months of knocking every night. His wife left him, took their son back to Virginia. Henderson stayed, stubborn as a mule. Then one night, tired and probably drunk, he shouted at the door, "Come in then and be damned." They found his smithy burning 3 days later. Never found Henderson, just his tools and a stain on the floor that no amount of scrubbing would remove. Samuel wrote this conversation in his journal, and I can see where his hand shook as he formed the letters. But he also wrote something else, something that shows the kind of man he was. November 12, 1878. If what Thomas says is true, and I am not yet convinced it is, then there must be a way to stop this that does not involve abandoning my home and livelihood. I am a blacksmith. I work with iron and fire. Every culture in the world has traditions about iron protecting against evil spirits. The Scots put iron in their cradles. The Irish nail horseshoes above their doors. If these guests are real, and if they can be stopped, then iron will stop them. This, right here, is what I find fascinating about Samuel Pritchard. He was a man of the 19th century, raised on Christianity and rationalism, the scientific method and Protestant work ethic. But he was also practical. When faced with something that defied his understanding of the world, he didn't just deny it. He adapted. He took the problem seriously and applied his skills to solving it. It's a lesson we could use today. We're often so locked into our worldview that we can't adapt when reality presents something outside our framework. Samuel was better than that. He started researching. He wrote letters to a professor at the University of Virginia who studied folklore. He talked to every old-timer in the county who would speak with him. He learned that iron, particularly forged iron, was considered proof against spirits in dozens of cultures. Cold iron, they called it. Not cast iron, but iron worked by human hands, shaped with intention and will. December 1st, 1878, the knocking has increased. Now it comes every night, sometimes for hours. Margaret is not sleeping well. Emily woke screaming last night, saying she saw faces at her window, though we are on the second floor and there is no way to reach that window without a ladder. I have begun my work. If iron can protect us, I will forge such protection as these things have never seen. Samuel's first attempts were simple. He made iron crosses and nailed them above each door and window. The knocking paused for one night, then resumed, louder than before. He made horseshoes and hung them everywhere, points up to catch any evil that might try to enter. The knocking continued. He created an iron chain and laid it across the threshold of the front door. Margaret reported that the knocking that night sounded angry, frustrated, but it didn't stop. "They're testing me," Samuel wrote. "Each thing I make, they pause as if to examine it, then continue. They're learning what doesn't work. But so am I. I'm learning what bothers them, what makes them hesitate. The chain worked best so far. Something about a continuous circle of iron, unbroken. I need to think larger." This is January of 1879 now. Winter in the Cumberland Gap, and the Pritchard family was under siege. The journal entries from this period are chaotic, written in a shaky hand. Samuel was sleeping maybe 3 hours a night, spending all his waking time either working for customers or experimenting with new iron protections. Margaret wrote a letter to her sister in Pennsylvania. I found it tucked into the journal, never sent. "Dear Ruth, I fear for Samuel's sanity and our safety. He speaks of nothing but iron and spirits. His eyes are wild, his hands are burned from working the forge at all hours. Emily refuses to sleep alone, and I confess I am glad for her company, for the sounds at night are no longer just knocking. There are voices now, calling our names in tones that are almost familiar, almost friendly, almost like our dead relatives come to visit. Last night I heard my mother's voice calling me to open the door. My mother has been dead these 10 years. I nearly opened it. I nearly did. Only Samuel's hand on my arm stopped me. We cannot go on this way." But Samuel had a plan forming. He'd noticed something in his research and in his experiments. The guests seemed bound by certain rules. They couldn't enter without invitation. They couldn't cross certain barriers of iron. They were strongest at night, weakest at dawn. And they seemed to be drawn to doorways, to thresholds, to the liminal spaces between inside and outside. January 15th, 1879. I understand now. Doors are the weak points, the places where the boundary between safety and danger is thinnest. A door is meant to open, meant to allow passage. That's why they knock. Not because they need the door to be opened physically, but because the very nature of a door is an invitation, a possibility of entry. I must make doors that are the opposite. Doors that are not invitations, but rejections. Doors that don't just close, but seal. Doors that don't just lock, but bind. He started working on what he called his sealed door. It took him 3 weeks of constant work. He used iron from 7 different sources, believing that the mixture of metals from different places would create a stronger spiritual barrier. He worked symbols into the iron that he'd found in his research: crosses, pentagrams, Solomon's seal, Celtic knotwork, and stranger things from older traditions. But the real innovation was in the structure. Samuel created a door frame that was a continuous circle of iron with no beginning and no end, welded seamlessly together. The door itself was iron, but not solid. He created it as a lattice, a web of iron that allowed air and light through, but presented an unbroken barrier of the metal in every direction. February 4th, 1879. The work is complete. I have hung my iron door in the frame of the smithy, replacing the wooden door entirely. It is a thing of beauty and terror. Margaret says it looks like a cage. She's right. It is a cage, but one designed to keep the predators out rather than the prey in. Tonight we will see if it works. That night, the knocking came as usual. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. But this time, Samuel noted a difference. The sound is changed. Before it was loud, insistent, almost jovial in its confidence. Now it sounds tentative, testing, and it stops after only a few minutes. No scratching follows. No voices. Just silence. For 3 nights there was peace. Then, on the 4th night, they came in force. Samuel's description of that night is the most detailed entry in his journal, written the following morning in a hand that shook so badly, some words are illegible. They came at midnight, not knocking now, but screaming. The sounds were like nothing I can describe to someone who has not heard them. Imagine the cry of a child in pain, mixed with the scream of a horse being slaughtered, mixed with a woman's death rattle, and beneath it all a sound like laughter. They surrounded the house. I could see them through the windows, though see is not quite the right word. They were there and not there, present but not fully in our world. Tall shapes, human-like but wrong in proportions, too long in the limbs, too wide in the mouth, eyes that reflected the lamplight like an animal's. Margaret and Emily huddled in the corner while I stood at my iron door with my rifle, though I knew bullets would be useless. The things outside tested every window, every door, every crack in the walls. I could hear them finding the iron protections I'd placed and recoiling from them with hisses of pain or anger. Then one of them spoke. Its voice was like dry leaves blowing across stone. "Samuel," it said, "Samuel Pritchard, we know you. We have watched you work your metal. You are skilled. You could do such work for us, such beautiful work. Open your door. Join us. We have such things to show you, such secrets of the forge that no living man knows." I was tempted. God help me, I was tempted. The voice promised knowledge of metallurgy beyond anything modern science had discovered. Techniques from civilizations long dead, the ability to forge metals that don't exist in nature. My hands actually reached for the door. Emily's scream stopped me. She was staring at the window where one of the things had pressed its face, or what served as its face, against the glass. "Daddy, don't!" she cried. "Please don't." The spell broke. I raised my rifle and fired at the thing at the window, knowing it would do nothing but needing to act. The glass shattered. The thing recoiled. And then, with a sound like 1,000 voices sighing in disappointment, they withdrew. My iron door held. Every protection held. We are safe for now. But Samuel knew they would come back. The guests had shown their hand. They wanted him specifically, wanted his skill at the forge. Why? That's what he needed to figure out. He dove deeper into research. He found records of other blacksmiths who'd had encounters with strange entities. A smith in Scotland in 1745 who'd forged iron bullets that could kill fairies. a metalworker in Bavaria who'd created chains that could bind demons, a forge master in ancient Rome who'd made weapons for fighting what the Romans called lemures, restless spirits of the dead. The pattern was clear. Blacksmiths, workers of iron and fire, occupied a special place in the supernatural world. They could create things that affected entities that were otherwise untouchable. They were both threatened by these entities and threatening to them. March 10, 1879, I understand now why they want me. Not to harm me, or not only that. They want me to work for them, to forge things in their service. What things? What could such entities need that requires physical metal? The answer chills me. They need anchors, ways to make themselves more present in our world. Iron can keep them out, but iron, properly worked with the right intention, might also let them in more fully. I am a door that swings both ways. This revelation led to Samuel's greatest work and his most terrible decision. If he was going to protect his family permanently, he couldn't just keep the guests out. He had to bind them, trap them, or destroy them. But how do you trap something that barely exists in physical space? How do you cage something that can slip through the cracks in reality? The answer came from an unlikely source. A traveling preacher came through Granger County in April of 1879, a man named Reverend Josiah Blackwood. Blackwood was educated, had studied theology at Princeton, but he also had an interest in what he called spiritual warfare. He'd made a study of exorcism, both Christian and otherwise, and he'd collected accounts of supernatural encounters from across the country. Samuel met with him, and after swearing him to secrecy, told him everything. Blackwood listened carefully, took notes, and then told Samuel something that changed everything. "These entities you call guests," Blackwood said, "I've heard of them before, under different names. The courteous folk in Scotland, the night callers in New England, the threshold walkers in New Orleans. They're the same type of being, appearing across cultures. And here's what you need to understand. They're not ghosts, not demons in the Christian sense. They're older than Christianity, older than most of our religions. They're what was here before, what the land itself remembers. They can't be destroyed, not really. But they can be bound if you know how." "How?" Samuel asked. "With their true names, ideally, but you'll never get those. The second best way is with iron forged under specific conditions and inscribed with binding symbols. Not crosses or Christian symbols. Those just repel them temporarily. You need older symbols. Symbols from the people who lived here before, who knew these things and knew how to deal with them." Blackwood gave Samuel a book, handwritten, full of symbols he'd collected from various sources. Cherokee symbols, he said, from before the removal. The Cherokee had lived in these mountains for centuries, and they'd known about the guests. They'd had their own names for them and their own ways of handling them. April 20th, 1879. Reverend Blackwood's book is a revelation. The symbols are unlike anything I've seen in European folklore. They don't ward off evil or repel spirits. They bind, they trap, they force supernatural entities into limited spaces and hold them there. The Cherokee worldview didn't divide the world into good and evil the way we Christians do. They understood that some beings simply exist, neither good nor evil, but dangerous nonetheless, like a bear or a rattlesnake. Not evil, but something to be wary of, to contain if necessary. I will forge a trap, a prison of iron, inscribed with these binding symbols. But the Reverend warned me, such a thing, once made, becomes a beacon. It will draw the guests like moths to flame. I must be prepared for a confrontation when I complete it. Samuel spent the next month preparing. He gathered more iron, selecting each piece carefully. He studied Blackwood's symbols until he could draw them from memory. He arranged for Margaret and Emily to stay with the Trents in town, telling them he had a large commission that would require dangerous forge work, and he didn't want them at risk from sparks or fumes. Margaret knew better. "You're going to fight them, aren't you?" she said. "I'm going to end this," Samuel replied, "one way or another." The forge he designed was his masterwork. It wasn't just a trap. It was a prison designed to hold beings that existed partially outside normal space. He created it as a sphere of iron, about 3 feet in diameter, made of interlocking bands that formed a geodesic pattern. Each band was inscribed with Cherokee binding symbols, worked into the metal while it was hot, sealed in with hammer blows and will. But here's the brilliant part, the thing that shows Samuel's genius. He designed it as a puzzle box. The bands could rotate and shift, and only when they were in the correct configuration would the sphere open. In the wrong configuration, it was sealed tighter than any lock. And he was the only one who knew the correct pattern. Inside the sphere, he placed an anchor, a piece of iron shaped like a hook, designed to catch and hold anything that entered the sphere's influence. The hook was inscribed with what Blackwood called a true name approximation, not the guests' real names, which they would never give up, but a description so accurate it functioned like a name. Those who walk thresholds uninvited, those who call from outside, those who seek entry without right. May 15th, 1879. The sphere is complete. It sits in my workshop and I can feel it working already. The air around it feels different, thicker, charged like before a thunderstorm. Tonight I will activate it fully. I have said goodbye to Margaret and Emily in case I do not survive. Margaret wept. Emily gave me her ribbon, a blue silk thing she wears in her hair, and asked me to tie it around my wrist for luck. I wear it now as I write this. I am afraid. I would be a fool not to be afraid, but I am also determined. These things have terrorized my family for months. They have turned our home into a place of fear. Whatever happens tonight, it ends. Either they are bound or I am dead. No third option exists. What happened that night, I can only piece together from Samuel's journal and from what others in town reported seeing and hearing. Samuel set up the sphere in his workshop at sunset. He built up his forge fire to maximum heat, making the building glow with red light visible from the town. He inscribed a circle around himself and the sphere in salt mixed with iron filings, an additional protection based on Blackwood's notes. Then he did something that seems insane. He invited them in. Not into his home, he wasn't that foolish. But he called out to them, challenged them, told them he had created something they needed to see, something they would want. He baited the trap with his own pride and skill. They came. Mrs. Trent, watching from her upstairs window in town half a mile away, reported seeing lights around the smithy. Not natural lights, she said later, cold lights, blue and green, like foxfire but brighter, and shadows that moved wrong, too fast and too slow at the same time. Samuel's journal entry, written the next morning in a hand so shaky it's barely legible, describes what he experienced. They came at full dark. All of them, I think, every one of these things that had been haunting us. The workshop filled with them, crowding in through the walls, through the very air itself. They were more visible than I'd ever seen them, and I wished they weren't. The human shape was just a suggestion, a framework they draped themselves in to avoid driving us mad. Underneath, they were wrong. Geometries that hurt to look at, colors that don't exist, sounds that were also smells that were also feelings. The one that had spoken before spoke again. You called us, Samuel. You made this. It gestured at the sphere with something that was partially a hand. You think to trap us, bind us? Foolish. We are older than your iron, older than your mountains, older than the stars you see in your sky. I stood my ground. Maybe so, I said, but I am a blacksmith and iron is my language, and in iron I am fluent beyond your understanding. I activated the sphere. I had built into it a mechanism, a spring-loaded trigger that required nothing but a hard strike with a hammer. I brought my 5-pound hammer down on the trigger point and the sphere exploded outward, not with physical force, but with spiritual force. The band spun and whirled, creating patterns in the air, and the binding symbols glowed red-hot without any fire touching them. The effect was immediate. The guests were pulled toward the sphere like water down a drain. They fought it, screaming in those terrible voices, reaching for me with their wrong limbs. One of them caught my arm, and where it touched, my skin turned grey and numb. But I held onto my hammer and kept striking the sphere, driving the mechanism, forcing it to work faster and harder. The sphere consumed them, not all at once, but in pieces. They were torn apart by the binding forces, drawn into the iron prison, compressed into a space far too small for what they were. The sounds they made as this happened were indescribable. I have heard animals in slaughterhouses. I have heard men dying on battlefields. Those sounds were nothing compared to this. It took hours, the longest hours of my life. My arm where they touched me is still numb, may always be numb. My eyes ache from seeing things eyes were not meant to see, but when dawn came, it was done. The sphere was silent and still, all the bands locked in their final configuration. Inside, I could feel them, compressed, bound, screaming silently in whatever passes for agony for such beings. I have won. God help me, I have won, but the cost... The entry ends there. Samuel didn't write in his journal again for a week. When he did, the entry was brief. I have hidden the sphere where it will never be found by accident. Let it stay there until the mountains themselves erode to dust. I have made 7 iron hooks, each one inscribed with a fragment of the binding symbols, and placed them around my property as a warning and a ward. If anything like the guests remains in these mountains, they will know what happened here and stay away. Margaret and Emily have returned home. Emily asked why I no longer wear her ribbon. I told her I left it somewhere safe. I did not tell her I tied it around the sphere before I sealed it, a reminder that I did this for her, for all of us, for every family that might have lived in fear as we did. I will not speak of this again. And he didn't. The rest of the journal is mundane stuff, accounts of work done, payments received, weather notes, Emily's progress in school. Samuel Pritchard lived another 30 years, dying in 1909 at the age of 73. He was respected in the community, known as a skilled craftsman and a reliable man. But he never took another commission that involved anything like what he'd created that night. He made horseshoes and tools, gates and nails, simple functional things. Nothing decorative, nothing that might require him to put intention and will into the shaping of metal the way he had for the sphere. And he never, ever worked with Cherokee symbols again. In fact, according to his later journal entries, he actively avoided them. When Emily, as an adult, brought home a book about local Native American history, Samuel threw it in the fire without explanation. Here's what I think happened, reading between the lines of what Samuel wrote and didn't write. I think the sphere worked, but not perfectly. I think something about the binding process was flawed, or incomplete, or just fundamentally impossible to do correctly with the knowledge he had. The guests were trapped, yes, but not destroyed. And being trapped, they were aware. They were suffering, and they would be suffering for as long as the sphere existed. Samuel had created eternal torment for beings that, as Reverend Blackwood pointed out, weren't evil in any meaningful sense. They were just dangerous, predatory. They followed their nature, as a bear or a snake follows its nature, and he had condemned them to endless imprisonment and pain. That's what haunted him for the rest of his life. Not fear of the guests, but guilt over what he'd done to them. You can see it in the way he wrote about Emily in later entries. Always concerned about her learning to be kind, to be merciful, to consider the suffering of others. He was trying to teach her the lesson he'd learned too late, that the ability to inflict suffering comes with the responsibility to consider whether you should. Now you might be thinking, so what? These things terrorized his family. They would have destroyed them if they could. Samuel did what he had to do. And you're right, he did. But that doesn't mean it didn't cost him something. That's the real horror of the story, not the supernatural elements. The real horror is what we become when we're forced to do terrible things for good reasons. How do we live with that? How do we reconcile the person we thought we were with the person we had to become? Samuel found his answer in normal life, in the everyday work of the forge, in raising his daughter and being a good husband and neighbor. He found redemption in ordinariness. But the sphere remained, hidden somewhere on this property, a reminder that some problems can only be solved with violence. And violence always costs us something. Now we come to the part that brought me into this story. I bought this property, as I mentioned, in 2019. I'm a writer, and I was looking for somewhere quiet to work, somewhere with history. The old smithy seemed perfect. The real estate agent mentioned it had character and stories. She had no idea. I found the journal in my 3rd week here. I spent the next month reading it, researching Samuel's story, verifying what I could. The records backed up the basic facts. Samuel Pritchard, blacksmith, lived here from 1877 to 1909. The Trents owned the general store. Reverend Josiah Blackwood did come through the county in 1879. Henderson, the previous blacksmith, did disappear under mysterious circumstances. But the sphere? That I couldn't verify. Samuel said he'd hidden it somewhere it wouldn't be found by accident. Where? I searched the obvious places first. The workshop, the house, the outbuildings, nothing. Then I started thinking about the way Samuel thought. He was systematic, logical, protective of his family. He'd want the sphere somewhere secure, but also somewhere that, if the worst happened, it could be found and dealt with. It took me 6 months to find it. 6 months of careful searching, of thinking like a 19th century blacksmith, of studying the property and its structures. Finally, I found a discrepancy. The forge itself, the big stone structure where Samuel did his metalwork, was slightly larger on the outside than on the inside. Not by much, maybe 2 feet on one side, but enough. I carefully dismantled part of the exterior stone wall and found a cavity. Inside was the sphere, wrapped in canvas and oilcloth, exactly as Samuel had left it. It was beautiful, terrifying, but beautiful. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Even after 140 years, the bands moved smoothly when I touched them. I couldn't help myself. The symbols inscribed on the iron were sharp and clear, as if they'd been made yesterday. And the thing hummed. Not a sound you could hear with your ears, but a vibration you could feel in your bones when you got close. I knew immediately I was holding something dangerous, maybe the most dangerous thing I'd ever touched. Samuel's warning was clear in the journal. This sphere contained entities that were hostile to human life, bound but not destroyed. If it was opened, they would be free. The smart thing would have been to rebury it, seal it back up, forget I ever found it. But I'm a writer, and writers are curious by nature, often stupidly so. I wanted to understand. I wanted to see if Samuel's work had actually succeeded. Had the guests really been bound? Were they still in there after all this time? Or had the whole thing been a delusion, a product of 19th century superstition and stress? I contacted experts, a professor of folklore at the University of Tennessee, a metallurgist who specialized in historical ironwork, a local Cherokee historian. Each of them examined the sphere, and each of them told me something different. The folklorist said the symbols were authentic, matched patterns found in pre-removal Cherokee spiritual practices. The metallurgist said the craftsmanship was beyond anything he'd seen from that period, that the metal had been worked in ways that shouldn't have been possible with 1879 technology. The Cherokee historian looked at it for a long time, then handed it back to me and said, "Some things are better left alone." I should have listened to her. I convinced myself I was being scientific about it. I set up cameras, recording equipment, measuring devices for temperature, electromagnetic fields, everything I could think of. Then, in a moment of what I can only call hubris, I tried to open the sphere. I rotated the bands, following a pattern I thought I'd deduced from studying the mechanism. Nothing happened at first. Then, on the 7th rotation, something shifted. The sphere grew cold, so cold that frost formed on the iron, despite it being July. The humming I'd felt before became a vibration so intense it made my teeth ache. And then I heard the knocking, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. Just like Samuel had described. I stopped immediately, rotated the bands back to their original position. The cold faded, the vibration ceased, the knocking stopped. But for the rest of that night, I sat in my house with every light on, listening to the silence and wondering what I'd almost released. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. On the 3rd day, exhausted and terrified, I made a decision. I took the sphere, drove 8 hours to the Smoky Mountains, and buried it in a cave I'd found while hiking years before. A deep cave, miles from any trail, where no one would stumble across it by accident. Before I buried it, I added my own contribution. I wrote a letter, similar to Samuel's journal but more direct, explaining what the sphere was and warning anyone who found it not to open it. I sealed the letter in a waterproof container and chained it to the sphere with iron chain. Then I collapsed the cave entrance as best I could, covering it with rocks and earth and brush. Is it perfect? No. Could someone find it eventually? Probably. But I made it as difficult as I could without simply destroying the sphere, which I couldn't bring myself to do. What if destroying it released the guests? I couldn't take that risk. Now you might be thinking this is all fantasy, a story I've made up for entertainment. I wish it were. But I still have Samuel's journal. I still have photos of the sphere before I buried it. And I still have the 7 iron hooks in my doorframe, each one inscribed with Cherokee symbols that I now understand are fragments of a much larger binding. More than that, I have the experience of those 3 days when I nearly opened the sphere. The feeling of wrongness, of something ancient and hostile pressing against reality, trying to get through. That's not something you forget or dismiss. So what did Samuel Pritchard forge to keep the guests out? On the surface, he forged iron protections, doors, chains, hooks, symbols. But really what he forged was a prison, a trap designed to end a threat by binding it forever. And that brings me to the educational part, the lesson I think this story contains. We live in a world full of threats, some mundane, some inexplicable. When faced with these threats, we have choices about how to respond. We can run, we can fight, or we can try to understand and contain. Samuel chose containment, but containment came at a cost. He created something that caused suffering, even if that suffering was inflicted on hostile entities. He lived with that guilt for 30 years. And ultimately, the problem wasn't solved, just delayed. The sphere still exists. The guests, if they're real, are still trapped. And someday, someone might open that sphere, either by accident or by intention. This is the fundamental problem with solutions based on force or imprisonment. They don't actually resolve anything. They just defer the resolution, often to a time when we're not around to deal with the consequences. Samuel understood this, I think. That's why he was so careful with his later work, why he avoided anything that might require him to exercise that kind of power again. There's another lesson here about belief and reality. Samuel was a rational man, a skilled craftsman who understood the physical world. But when confronted with something outside his understanding, he didn't deny it or rationalize it away. He engaged with it on its own terms, using knowledge from sources he normally wouldn't have considered. Cherokee spiritual practices, folklore, old magic. We could learn from that flexibility. Too often, we're so committed to our worldview that we can't adapt when reality presents something outside it. We deny, we rationalize, we force-fit the evidence into our pre-existing beliefs. Samuel did the opposite. He said, I don't understand this, but it's real, so I need to learn new things to deal with it. That's scientific thinking at its core, by the way, not the denial of anything that doesn't fit current theory, but the willingness to expand theory to accommodate new observations. Samuel was more scientific in his approach to the supernatural than many people are in their approach to the natural world. Now let me address the elephant in the room. Is this story true? Did the guests really exist? Is the sphere really buried in a cave in the Smokies? I can tell you that Samuel Pritchard was real. The journal exists. The iron hooks are still in my doorframe. The sphere existed. I have photos. Whether the guests were real supernatural entities or some kind of mass hallucination or psychological phenomenon, I can't say for certain. I can only tell you what I experienced and let you draw your own conclusions. But here's what I think is true. Regardless of the objective reality of the guests, Samuel believed he was protecting his family from a real threat. He applied his skills and knowledge to that task with dedication and courage. He succeeded in ending the immediate threat, but created a long-term problem in the process, and he lived with the moral weight of what he'd done for the rest of his life. That's real human experience. That's a real moral dilemma. Whether the guests were literal monsters or metaphorical ones doesn't change the essential truth of Samuel's story. And the hooks? They're still on my doorframe. I've left them there, partially as a historical artifact, partially as a reminder, and partially, I'll admit it, as a precaution. Because on certain nights, when the wind is right and the moon is full, I sometimes hear something that might be knocking. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. It might be a branch hitting the house. It might be the old building settling. It might be my imagination, primed by Samuel's journal and my own experience with the sphere. Or it might be that binding the guests didn't capture all of them. That some remained free, watching, waiting, knocking at doors and hoping for an invitation. I've never opened the door when I hear that sound. I never will. Samuel Pritchard's story is, at its heart, about the price of protection. What are we willing to do to keep our families safe? What lines are we willing to cross? And how do we live with ourselves afterward? These are questions every generation faces in different forms. Samuel faced them literally, forging iron barriers against supernatural threats. We face them metaphorically, building walls and systems and laws to protect ourselves from perceived dangers. But the underlying question remains the same: at what cost? Samuel's answer was, whatever the cost, I'll pay it. He did pay it in guilt and silence and careful ordinariness for the rest of his life. He protected his family, but he lost something of himself in the process. Was it worth it? Margaret and Emily lived long, happy lives. Emily married, had children of her own, died peacefully in 1954 at the age of 83. By that measure, yes, it was worth it. Samuel's sacrifice achieved its purpose. But I think about those entities in the sphere, if they existed, if they're still there, trapped for 145 years and counting, suffering in whatever way such beings suffer, all because they followed their nature and encountered a human skilled enough and desperate enough to stop them. Is that justice? Is that self-defense? Or is it something darker, a kind of cosmic cruelty that we're capable of when we're frightened enough and powerful enough? I don't have answers to these questions. I just have Samuel's journal, my own experiences, and a growing sense that the world is stranger and more dangerous than we like to admit. The guests, whatever they were, represented something true. That there are forces in the world beyond our understanding, and sometimes the only way to survive them is to do things we're not proud of. The 7 iron hooks on my doorframe are a reminder of that truth. Samuel forged them as wards, as warnings, as symbols of what he'd done and what he was willing to do. They're still doing their job. 145 years later, they mark this place as somewhere the guests learned to fear. But they also mark it as somewhere a human learned to be fearsome. And I'm not sure which is more unsettling. I still live in Samuel's house. I still work in his smithy, though I've converted it to a writing studio. And sometimes, late at night, I put my hand on those iron hooks and think about the man who made them. A man who faced something impossible and found a way to fight back. A man who paid a price for protecting his family and carried that weight with quiet dignity for 3 decades. There's heroism in that, but also tragedy. Samuel Pritchard was a good man who did a hard thing, and it cost him more than anyone knew. The hooks are his legacy, his warning, his confession. They're still there, still doing their job, still keeping something out. What exactly they're keeping out, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe supernatural entities, maybe just the memory of fear. Maybe the knowledge of what we're capable of when we're desperate enough. But they work. In the 5 years I've lived here, nothing has crossed my threshold uninvited. And on nights when I hear that knocking, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, I touch those iron hooks and remember Samuel's lesson. Some barriers are worth maintaining, some prices are worth paying, and some doors should never, ever be opened. The sphere is buried. The guests are bound, if they ever existed. And the iron hooks remain, pointing downward like accusing fingers, like warning signs, like the last testament of a blacksmith who forged something stronger than metal. He forged protection. He forged a prison. He forged a burden he carried to his grave. And in doing so, he forged a story that needed to be told, a warning that needed to be passed down, a reminder that the things we make to protect ourselves can themselves become sources of fear and guilt. That's what the 1880 Appalachian Blacksmith forged to keep the guests out. Not just iron, but a legacy of fear and courage, of protection and imprisonment, of love twisted into something darker by necessity. The hooks are still there. I pass them every day. And I think about Samuel, and I think about the guests, and I think about the sphere buried somewhere in the mountains, humming its silent warning to anyone who might find it. Some doors should stay closed, some prisons should stay sealed. Some stories should be remembered not as entertainment, but as warnings. This is one of them.